Good day. Over the last few hours, there have been further attempted attacks by Ukraine on various parts of the battlefield, the battlefronts, against the Russian military. There's a fairly significant attack in the Kharkiv area, the Kharkiv North Donbass area. But again, as has now become the increasingly regular pattern, the attack was repelled with heavy losses. There were also more minor attacks in other places, including an attack in Kherson region, which apparently did not achieve very much either. It's now universally accepted that the Russians are digging in Kherson region, and that those earlier reports of the Russians evacuating their forces from the west bank of the Dnieper, which were widely published in the Western media, that those reports, it turns out, were wrong. The Ukrainian Defense Minister, Mr. Reznikov, has told the Japanese media, he's given an interview to the Japanese media in which he says that Ukraine still has a plan to capture Kherson city, but he admits that the Ukrainian offensive has slowed down. And President Zelensky's spin doctor, Mr. Arestovich, has, in rather more colourful language, effectively said the same thing. He also says that the Russians are now heavily reinforcing in Kherson region, and that there is no sign of any sort of pull-out of Russian forces from Kherson region. Now, this all puts parts of the media in the West in a rather complicated position because, of course, just a few days ago, they were all reporting a Russian pullback, a retreat from Kherson region. They were claiming that the Russian military was retreating from Kherson region and was pulling back from the west side of the Dnieper River to the east side of the Dnieper River. So perhaps in an attempt to try to get round that particular problem, we've now had a report in the New York Times that the reason that there hasn't been this pullback from the west side of the Dnieper River to the east side of the Dnieper River is that no less a person than President Putin himself has supposedly rejected the advice of his generals to conduct such a withdrawal. And that repeats, by the way, an earlier claim made way back in September that Russian generals were advising Putin to pull all of Russia's forces west of the Dnieper River to the east bank, abandoning Kherson city to Ukraine. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I would love to know how the New York Times or the usual anonymous sources in the Western intelligence community know about the private discussions that take place between President Putin and his military officials, because I have no idea. I would be extremely surprised indeed if those sort of discussions, which surely take place in very secure surroundings, are made generally accessible and within the Russian bureaucratic system. And I would also be extremely surprised if the Western intelligence community, which seems extremely ill-informed about things going on in Russia, actually has an informer at that particular level. That is not to deny that the possibility of a withdrawal from the west bank of the Dnieper to the east bank has been discussed at the top level within the Russian high command. I'm sure that there have been such discussions, and I'm sure that those discussions have involved President Putin. But taking the view that Putin overruled his generals, ignored their advice, told them that they must stand and fight and defend Kherson despite their wishes. That seems to me to be no more than a guess, and probably a bad guess, and I strongly suspect it's wrong. I suspect that there was discussions, people talked about the difficulties of holding on to Kherson region, talked about the need to improve logistics. I'm sure that there were discussions about possible options to pull the troops back, but clearly a decision was eventually taken to stand firm and to defend the city, and with more reinforcements now becoming available as a result of the call-up of reservists, I suspect that is gradually becoming easier, thereby explaining Reznikov's comment that the offensive to capture Kherson region has supposedly slowed down. By the way, that isn't true either, at least not at the time of the making of this video. It's not the case that the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region has slowed down. In reality, what seems to have happened is that it has come to a complete stop. There have been Ukrainian attacks, but they have all been repelled, with Ukraine always suffering very heavy losses. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. There's very confused reports coming out from Bakhmut city. The Ukrainians at one point were claiming that they'd launched some kind of a counterattack near Bakhmut city, that they'd successfully captured or recaptured a place called the asphalt plant from the Russian military there. Turned out that was wrong. On the contrary, it seems that the Wagner organization continues to make incremental advances as it advances successfully towards Bakhmut city. It tightens its grip around it. But as I said, I'm not going to pretend that information from Bakhmut city is very accessible. So that, it seems to me, is the situation on the battlefronts. As I said previously, it's consistent with General Surovikin's interview. He talked about strengthening the front lines, building up reserves, waging a war of attrition against the Ukrainian forces. That's the tactics that the Russian military appear to be following in Ukraine at the moment, even as this remorseless build-up of men and machines, as the call-up from Russia continues, even as that goes on. And whilst I'm on the subject of this Russian build-up, there have been reports from Ukraine that Ukraine also is now mooting a further mobilization of reservists to try to counter this Russian build-up. I'm going to say straight away that I think that's going to be very difficult. My impression is that Ukraine has already called up most of the people who are probably suitable for fighting in this war, and as well as a lot of people, by the way, who are arguably too old to be suitable for fighting in this war. There's been some talk of calling up women, which I think for various reasons is not a good idea. And, you know, this isn't, I think, this shouldn't be, I think, too much of a contested point, but calling up women to fight on the front lines, to my mind, has obvious problems, whatever willingness those women have to fight in that kind of way. And it's something that militaries generally avoid doing, and rightly so. Anyway, putting all that aside, I doubt that Ukraine has large reserves that it can still call up. Some talk about putting together an army of 4 million. I have to say, I think all that is fantasy. Regardless, that's the situation at the moment. Even if Ukraine does start calling up troops on that kind of scale, it would presumably take a long time to train them. I'm not sure how they even would be trained, actually. And by that time, the Russian forces, these called up Russian forces, will already be in action. Now, having said all of this, on the other side, whilst Ukraine talks about mobilizations, we see the Russian military, the Russians on their part, very, very busy. Putin had a meeting yesterday with his Prime Minister Mishustin, and certain other officials, and Mishustin briefed Putin on the work of the new coordinating council. I've discussed that council previously in a series of programs I did after the setting up of that council was discussed, and I said that this council, the setting up of this council, is a clear sign that the Russians are now working towards a big war, and that they're now mobilizing more and more of their economy to support their military as the war is conducted. And I'm going to just go back just to touch on a few things. And I said I made comparisons between this coordinating council and the State Defense Committee that Stalin and the Soviets set up during the Second World War, which also basically ran the home front and took responsibility for arms production and that kind of thing. Stalin basically conducted the Second World War through two committees. One was Stavka, which I've talked about before in my previous programs, which is essentially a committee of military people, and that was where Stalin met with the military leaders, with the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Marshal Zhukov, and the Chief of Staff and other top military leaders, and that was where they discussed and thrashed out their plans, for offensives and whatever during the Second World War, with the General Staff being then given the task of elaborating the plans and assigning the troops and working out the logistics to put those plans discussed at the level of Stavka into operation. So that was one committee, and the other committee was GKO, the State Defense Committee, which operated, as I said, the home front, mobilized the factories, got the production, the arms production going, ensured that food and supplies were provided both to the military and to the civilian population. And as I said, I'm not an expert in these things. John Helmer is perhaps the best expert, at least amongst those who provide websites. I'm sure there's a vast academic literature on this topic. And the more I've looked into this, the more I've come to the view that Stavka and the GKO, the State Defense Committee, were not in a hierarchy with each other. It wasn't the case that one was above the other. It was rather that these two committees essentially worked in parallel as a team, with Stalin chairing each and providing the coordination that they needed. And I suspect this is probably something like the structure that exists in Russia now. So we have the Coordinating Council, which is in charge of the home front, if you like. If you follow the readout of Putin's discussions with Mishustin, that's the sort of sense you get, that they're providing the supplies, sorting up getting the factories working, the arms working, the medication, all of that. And one part of this discussion is who is assigned to which role. Particular officials are assigned to particular roles. So a woman called, an official, a minister called Tatiana Galikova is in charge of medical supplies, for example. Denis Manturov, deputy prime minister, formerly, and the industry minister, he appears to be in charge of arms production. So, you get all of that sort of thing. That's the work of the coordinating council. Putin doesn't chair the council, but he has briefings, regular briefings provided to him by Mishustin. And alongside that, there is a military council, a Stavka, if you like. I'm going to guess that that's chaired by Shoigu, the defense minister. That's where the military plans are thrashed out. And every so often, Putin probably has meetings with Shoigu and the military leaders, and that's where they discuss the various plans with the general staff, assigned the role of carrying out the plans, and with General Surovikin, the actual commander-in-chief of the forces on the battlefronts, undertaking now increasingly the key role. And I would say that there's an article in Politico which says that since Surovikin's appointment, Western agencies have detected an increasing cohesion and effectiveness in the way that the Russians are conducting their operations in Ukraine. So it looks as if the Russians are getting things increasingly together. They're engaging in this major build-up, and every part of the Ukrainian offensive, in Kherson, in Kharkiv, against Zaporozhye, for the time being, is at a standstill. So that's the situation on the battlefields. There's been an absolutely bizarre, completely extraordinary development, which I really must touch on, which is this decision of the 30 Democrat Congress people who put together that letter, which I discussed in my video yesterday. That letter, which suggested that the United States take the lead in seeking negotiations with Russia to find some kind of diplomatic or negotiated settlement to the war. Those 30 Democrats, or at least some of them, have now repudiated the letter. The group, the congressperson who was apparently the person who organized the signing of the letter, has now repudiated it. That person has now said that the letter should never have been sent at all, that it wasn't vetted properly. The staff of the Congress people, quite shockingly, is being blamed for the fact that this letter was published. This whole thing has turned into a total debacle. And the Congress people are now saying, yes, there do need to be negotiations. Diplomacy must indeed take place, but that must happen once Ukraine has achieved victory. Now, what Ukrainian victory? We've seen this Ukrainian offensive. It's been carried out since the end of August. Thousands, probably tens of thousands of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, have died in the conduct of that offensive. The Russians, obviously, have suffered losses too. All the indications are that they are very, very much lighter. Tanks, Ukrainian tanks, artillery, machines have been destroyed in very, very large numbers. We hear all the time now about the difficulties the West has in replacing all this machinery that has been supplied, all these weapon systems that have been supplied to Ukraine and which have been lost. We hear how Western arsenals are now becoming increasingly depleted of critical weapon systems. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to provide Ukraine with artillery, with ammunition for artillery, with HIMARS systems. That apparently has now come to essentially an end. There's little prospect now of supplying Ukraine with more HIMARS missiles. Or the last delivery was, I believe, 4 launchers. Probably not enough to replace losses. And on top of that, we have this huge missile offensive that the Russians have conducted. Rockets attacking Ukrainian its civilian energy infrastructure. 30 to 40% of that infrastructure destroyed. The Ukrainian railway system now having to convert to diesel locomotives in place of electric ones, except of course Ukraine doesn't have many diesel locomotives. We hear that there's now rolling blackouts in Ukrainian cities, that Ukrainians are being forced to stock up on candles and firewood. So where is this victory? Ukrainian offensive, as I said, is at a standstill. The Russians are building up their forces. Bakhmut, situation in Bakhmut, from Ukraine's point of view, goes from bad to worse. So what victory are we talking about? Where is this victory going to come? Where is the victory which is going to pave the way for negotiations? And in the meantime, economic situation in the West gets worse. I've been looking at, as I said yesterday in my video, I've been looking at the market surveys in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, especially those in Britain and Germany, point to catastrophic contractions. Market surveys in Russia speak of an expanding economy going forward. There's growing optimism there. And a report from Reuters that Russia's oil trade, that the Russians are going to be able to sidestep Western sanctions, the Western oil price cap on their oil. They'll be able to sell 80 to 90% of their oil to customers who will not adhere to the oil price cap. And moreover, the Russians are finding ships to transport the oil, and they're sorting out their own insurance systems with help from countries like India and China, thereby reducing the former global coverage of the London-based Lloyd's insurance market. So the West is depleting its military reserves. It's now having to dredge out Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to try to provide some support to Ukraine's rapidly diminishing anti-aircraft missile arsenal. This is a missile system that was first brought into service by the United States in 1959. Yes, it went through a major upgrade in 1971. It continued to be put in use throughout the Cold War and beyond. But already in the early 1990s, it was being fully replaced by the Patriot system, which of course had already started entering service in the United States sometime before, in the 1980s. So dredging out this old system, this old Hawk anti-aircraft system, because, well, we dare not send Patriot missiles to Ukraine. If we did, take ages probably for the Ukrainians to train to use them. And besides, it's probably an escalation that we can't even consider. So we're palming off on the Ukrainians this old, outdated system. And that's apparently been done in part because we have no more Stinger missiles that we can supply them. Such Stingers as we have to keep in our already depleted reserves. And in the meantime, tens of billions of dollars are being sent every month to Ukraine. We now hear that Ukraine is going to get perhaps another $40 billion of financial aid next year. That's just to keep the Ukrainian economy ticking along. I saw a report that in terms of the value of military and economic aid that Ukraine has already received this year, that already equals the amount of Ukraine's pre-war GDP, $150 billion. And we're just going to go on shoveling money at Ukraine, pouring weapons into Ukraine, or at least trying to, because we may not have many weapons to send. And we're bleeding Ukraine itself and seeing it collapse, even as our own economies go into ever deeper contraction. And we're not going to negotiate because we can't negotiate until Ukraine itself achieves victory. This is completely dishonest. This is not a policy. This is not even a pose anymore. It's an abdication of total abdication of responsibility on the part of the political class, on behalf of Western governments. We've got ourselves into a situation where we have no exit, even as we propel all the way downwards. Ukraine is being taken apart, it's being demolished. Millions of people apparently are leaving. Its army is bleeding on the battlefields, and Western economies are spiraling downwards into recession. And we can't, in the face of all of that, even pick up the phone and discuss with the Russians a possible way out. And of course, the excuse given is that, and this is the excuse which the White House gave, is that there can be no negotiations with Russia without Ukraine, and it must be the Ukrainians who take the lead in negotiations. Well, that's not only absurd, given that we are paying for the entirety of this war, it's also dishonest as well. Because when Ukraine did conduct negotiations with the Russians back in March, and when negotiations almost succeeded, it was we in the West who put those negotiations to a stop. Boris Johnson telephoned Zelensky, told him to take all the concessions back, told him that if Ukraine went ahead with this proposal that had been hammered out in Istanbul, then the British and the Americans would refuse to give the security guarantees to Ukraine, which were an essential part of that proposal. So, on that basis, the Ukrainians pulled out of the negotiations and took back all the concessions that they made. And subsequently, Boris Johnson again travels to Kiev. These are in his last weeks as Prime Minister, and again he tells Ukraine, don't negotiate, don't give anything away. So on the one hand we say we can't negotiate until the Ukrainians decide to, and on the other hand we're saying to the Ukrainians, don't negotiate at all, don't make any concessions. So we have to have a victory which is gradually receding into the distance, and which, to be frank, is completely unachievable. We're allowing Ukraine to be destroyed, and at the same time our economies are going into a tailspin, and in the meantime men on the battlefields are dying, probably in the thousands every day. Now I cannot understand the morality and rationality of this policy. But here we go. We see how a small number of people in the West, because it is a small number of people, make no mistake about this, have achieved what they have achieved in every crisis that I can remember, going all the way back to the crises in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. They set out the parameters for maximalist objectives, which in every case prove unachievable. They shout down everybody who disagrees with them. They have the megaphone of the media, which supports them. They have allies within the political and foreign policy establishment who also support them, and of course they have the funding of the various military and arms industries that also provide them with the backing that they need. And the result is wars are funded, wars are fought, people die, and always and invariably they end in a debacle. They ended in a debacle in Iraq, they ended in a debacle in Afghanistan, they ended in a debacle in Libya. Well, we haven't yet seen the debacle in Yugoslavia, though that is a prolonged affair, but I am convinced, I am absolutely sure that in time a hideous debacle there will also come. And of course, we are now hurtling towards the abyss of the biggest debacle of all, which is the debacle that's coming in Ukraine. And anybody, as I said, who, however nervously, however apologetically, however carefully, comes forward and suggests, let's try and find a way to get off this runaway train, they get shouted at, they get abused, they get threatened. Elon Musk, for example, threatened with investigation. Over what precisely? We see reports that there's doubts about whether he should be allowed to take over Twitter because doing so might be a national security risk. So he's not even allowed to express opinions, which is all he's done on Twitter. And he comes under relentless attack and, as I said, threatened with investigations, threatened with a block on his, frankly, very unhappy acquisition of Twitter, even as he's been providing essential support to Ukraine through his Starlink system. And we see these timid Congress people who very frightened with all, with lots of fear, with lots of nervousness, put together a letter, very weak, soft letter, suggesting that negotiations might be a possible idea this time, a necessary thing. Well, they too are shouted down, they too are intimidated, and they retract that letter within 24 hours. I have to say that I have never known a situation in the West where the political class has failed more completely than it has failed over this war. There's a good article by Anatol Lieven on the Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, in which he points out the disaster that this war is turning out to be for Germany. How Germany is facing deindustrialization on the Duran. We've talked about that extensively. What profound impact that will have on German society. We've talked about that too on the Duran, and how the crisis in German society that may cause might lead eventually to the rise of all sorts of political forces, conceivably the AfD or Die Linke, which might not be as willing to bankroll the EU project as the current political order in Germany, dominated by the SPD, the CDU, and of course the FDP and the Greens have been. But again, anybody in Germany who stands out, who talks about these things, who suggests negotiations, they come under abuse, they come under attack. Robert Habeck, the Vice-Chancellor, apparently tells any officials who raise objections about any particular new sanctions that he comes up with. He says those are Putin talking points. He even has them investigated, or so I've heard or been told. And of course, former German chancellors, face abuse because once upon a time, in another period, They actually sought good relations, good economic relations with Russia, underpinning Germany's economic growth. So Gerhard Schröder now looks like he might be expelled from the SPD, the party he led as Chancellor. And of course, Angela Merkel comes in for criticism as well. And conceivably, the president of Germany, Steinmeier, well, he's also come in for his share of abuse. And who knows, perhaps he'll come in for even more before long. I have to say, it's a disastrous picture. Eventually, there will be a reckoning. Because, as I've said previously, a situation in which Russia grows stronger, its economy is growing, it's successfully carrying out import substitution programs, it's developing its diplomatic links. Shoigu, the defense minister, has just spoken to the defense ministers of India and China, for example. He's had apparently friendly conversations with those defense ministers. So Shoigu is active and back in action. And not just Shoigu, other contacts with between the Russians and these countries. As I said, they've all said they're not going to comply with the West's oil price cap. Turkey is engaging with Russia to build a gas price hub. Saudi Arabia wants to join the BRICS. The Russian military is getting more weapons. Far from Russia being weakened, if that's the plan. I mean, at the moment, objectively, it's getting stronger. But we must continue with this disastrous, failing strategy until Ukraine achieves a victory. No explanation as to how that's going to be done. No ideas, no plan, no strategy that I can see. There's apparently the 101st Airborne Division is now in Romania, all 4,000 of them, lightly equipped. There's been suggestions that this might be the tip of a force that could be deployed in Ukraine. I predict, by the way, that when it becomes increasingly clear that Ukraine is going to be defeated, when a military collapse in Ukraine finally comes, many of these voices we've been hearing, who, as I said, have shouted down all opponents or critics of this war, they're going to now start demanding some kind of military intervention by the West in Ukraine. Well, I've seen all sorts of intelligent, experienced military people pointing out the absurdity of that and pointing out how the 101st Airborne Division is in no position to take on the mechanized armored forces of the Russian army, and that it would be a disaster to try to use it in that sort of way. And as for the European members of NATO, how are they going to fight? Poland has given most of its tanks to Ukraine. It's given some of its aircraft to Ukraine. Not that people talk about that very much. It's given many of its weapons to Ukraine. The Czech Republic has done the same. Slovakia has done the same. Western inventories, as I said, have been depleted. So we'll get the demands for military intervention in Ukraine to rescue Ukraine, risking a war against a nuclear superpower, which is Russia, except, of course, that the people who will be demanding that, who are the same people who are demanding all the weapons supplies, will be oblivious to the fact that the key weapon systems, the inventories of those weapon systems that might, in some fantastic scenario, have been used to support that intervention, that those weapon supplies have been depleted anyway, putting aside the hideous risks of taking on Russia in a place like Ukraine. So What is the plan? What are we going to do? The Ukrainian offensive is stalled. Any hope of achieving victory looks increasingly unlikely. Reznikov, the Ukraine's defense minister, is himself saying that the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region has slowed down. Prospects of capturing Kherson city are diminishing. Perhaps something will be pulled together. Perhaps Kherson will be captured. No doubt that will cause some ructions in Russia. That looks increasingly unlikely to me, but even if it happens, that won't end the war, and the Russian forces are gathering. So what, and I ask this again, what is the plan? Those 30 Congress people, they didn't put forward a plan, they merely put forward a suggestion to talk. Well, that surely is an essential first step. If we don't talk, what we're going to get instead is not a messy and unsatisfactory compromise, far less favourable to us than the agreement Ukraine almost came to with Russia at the end of March, not to mention the agreement that the Minsk II process represented. But at least we might get some kind of agreement now. If we don't, well, we're going to have another massive defeat on our hands in Ukraine, just as we've had in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, particularly humiliatingly in Afghanistan, and of course going back further still in South Vietnam. But that seems to be where we're going, because every attempt to question the driver of this runaway train, to suggest to the driver that maybe we need to start putting the brake on, every suggestion is shouted down, and apparently people in the political class, some of whom clearly know better, they're too intimidated to argue back and to argue otherwise. I have to say, I'm sorry if I've come across as a bit, shall we say, emotional in this video, but I hope I've explained why. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. I'm not going to say anything more. Just to remind you that you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, Telegram, BitChute, and of course also Rofkin. Please also remember that I do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. They're exclusive to Locals. If you want to put questions to me, that's a good place to do it. And also you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also go to our shop, buy the many great things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all the rest that you will find there. Well, thank you for joining me again today. If you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and check your subscription to this channel, and more from me soon. And have a very good day until my next video.